Okay, wonderful. Just let me see what I need to do. I share my screen if you don't mind. I have prepared a presentation. Where is it? Okay, enter your screen. Bear with me if something is not working as expected. All right.
It's looking good,
Just
Michael.
start.
You can see your screen.
Yeah.
Good. One step further, at least. All right. First of all, I want to say thank you to Broadcom for this opportunity to take over. Let me say take over this office hours in August. The plan is that I will talk about a little bit about experiences I was able to collect at a customer I'm working for. My name is Michael Müller. I'm here in Germany. Good morning and good afternoon, and wherever you're sitting. I'm a principal services consultant at HCL and had the lucky situation that I was able to work for that customer and collecting a fair amount of experiences in the Graphman area. And that's exactly what I want to talk about. Yeah, go ahead.
Marcus, just one. You're in presenter mode, not screen show mode, so we can see your kind of next slide thing. So maybe if you can switch displays. Yeah.
If you tell me how. Thank you very much for this hint, but I'm stopping sharing.
Go into presentation mode again. I think you just needed to hit swap displays or whatever it is once you're in presenter.
Yeah, not sure. I assume that you're currently not seeing my presentation.
Yeah, we're not seeing anything right now.
Okay. Maybe I'm not.
I always have that problem. I always have that problem trying to do that.
There's two ways you could do it. You can either share the screen that's the presentation's going to be on, or to Aaron's point in your slide, where there's usually a swap screens command that you can select to switch the presenter notes and the actual presentation between screens. So
yeah, let me see.
And while Michael's working on that, I want to further introduce him. Michael's been great to work with. He started working with our Graphman feature very early on when it was released as preview. And he's been one of the main contributors to it, even contributing, enhancements to the Graphman client and the Layer 7 community, all the way until it went GA in 11.1.1. So we're super happy to have Michael share his experience with you. With Graphman at his customer. So, Michael, why don't you give it another shot?
Yeah, I'm sorry for this trouble. Thank you for saying so good things about myself.
Yeah, just means people can see it clearer. But yeah, if you're not sharing now, but if you share again, we can try and talk you through it if we can see it.
And we got time.
Okay, you should see at least something. And I will just not start the presenter mode. I will just leave it as it is right here.
Oh, you could start it if you want to. We can tell you how to flip screens if it happens again.
Okay, I'm starting presenter mode, but I fear that you see.
So now we do see the speaker notes, but when you go to display settings up on the menu bar, you can say swap preventer view and slide. There you go. Now we're seeing the slides.
That easy. Thank you very much for your support.
You learn something.
Appreciate it a lot. Yeah, exactly. Especially when it comes to Gateway and Graphman as well. Anyway, I mentioned that already. I'm a principal services consultant at HCL. I was in the lucky situation to support a customer from us by moving from a very manual, error-prone deployment procedures through a very good supported automated deployment procedure using Graphman, GitLab, and Jenkins. I want to take this opportunity to share some experiences we've collected at that customer, in that project. We'll have a kind of agenda. We'll talk about, of course, starting with Graphman, what it is at all. You might not be familiar with. You might not haven't even worked with it. What kind of interfaces do we have? I do a short comparison between GMU and Graphman. But I will also talk about the other tools that are, in my understanding, somehow belong together when talking about deployment automation. A repository tool, we here have used GitLab. This was an on-premise installation at that customer. And we are using this for for building up repositories of our gateways. It points out at the end that GitLab plays a very central role in all this kind of organizational part when you think about deployment automation. Anyway, at the end, we use Jenkins, which was set already at that customer as well, as an automation orchestrator. My understanding is it doesn't need to be Jenkins. It could be any kind of automation tool, just something which you can have control on, which is able to execute whatever necessities you have in order, so to say. And the fourth part might be the most interesting one. I will talk about how these three tools are working together. And yeah, let's see how we get through. In general, if you have any question, don't hesitate to interrupt me. I'm happy to answer it, even though I am guessing that we have a Q&A session afterwards as well. But to my experience, I'm often, when I'm listening to a presentation, I just got a question in mind, have that important for me, but at the end of the presentation, I just forgot it. So please don't hesitate to interrupt me. Okay, so let's start with Graphman. What is it? Is it just another maintenance tool? Potentially, yes, but it offers a great improvement of what you might know or have learned in the past. Graphman, what it is at all. First of all, it's just an API on a gateway. And the API, its purpose is, in my understanding, to maintain resources on that gateway. The API is a GraphQL-based API. What is GraphQL? GraphQL is just different type of API. We know SOAP APIs, we know REST APIs. GraphQL is a more modern way in kind of handling APIs or kind of handling requests through these APIs. And in my simple understanding, I'm often comparing GraphQL-based APIs to database access. A GraphQL API is schema-based, so you have a predefined set of if you think of database, kind of tables. You have a predefined set of columns. This is described in the schema, and you can easily compare a GraphQL query to an SQL to a database select statement, in my understanding, where you can map tables to resource types like cluster-wide properties, JDBC connection, certificates, keys, whatever you know from what you are maintaining or changing through the policy manager when you are working with the gateway and changing stuff. But of course, also services and policies. Columns are the properties of the resources. Even though the select clause part of a select statement you have influence on, so you can select dedicated columns, or let me say properties of dedicated resources, and you not have to extract all the properties of a resource entity at once. This is more or less what you do when you are using REST-based APIs. You can even have influence on the from clause, because you can say, well, I want to select cluster-wide properties, JDBC connections, and keys, and have this kind of query especially available or separately available. The only kind of restricted part is the where clause part. The schema defines a list of predefined constraints, so to say, for example, like a policy by a name or a certificate by a thumbprint. So this can't be influenced. This is just hard-coded, so to say. This is defined by the schema. However, already you might recognize already this kind of flexibility and generic approach offers you the ability to only look at stuff you are really interested in. For example, I only want to know the name of the certificates I have in my cert store, but the rest I don't care about. So you can reduce the amount of data just by using these kind of queries. Yeah, the endpoint is very simple. It's just your gateway, your listen port, and /Graphman is the endpoint of the API. The API only accepts post requests, as far as I'm aware. The body of the post request defines what you want to do. Actually, more or less, it's differentiate between read access and write access, query and so-called mutations. One of the key differences in my understanding is that the data format which is in use is JSON. JSON, to me, in my opinion, is a very human-friendly format to read stuff, to understand things, and at the end also to manipulate things. As I mentioned here, it's much more human-readable than XML, which isn't used by GMU. And when it comes to scripting and manipulating stuff, manipulating data, which might be necessary, it is even very handy for scripting and automation with JavaScript as well. So to me, in my opinion, a very big advantage getting away from XML. Interfaces. What kind of interface does Broadcom provide to this Graphman API? Two of them. First of all, the Graphman client, the interfaces are downloadable from GitHub. So public available for everyone who is interested in. And the Graphman client consists of two different kind of APIs. One is a Postman collection, which is great if you want to understand how GraphQL works. How do the GraphQL queries look like in detail? So if you're interested in GraphQL, take a look at the Postman collection. As far as I'm aware, it contains all queries that are available through that API. So you can take a look at all the stuff on the gateway you are interested in. However, we at that customer switched over very fast to the so-called Graphman client command line interface. This command line interface provides a more kind of business-related functions, and it hides the complexity and the details of GraphQL details. Yeah, it is a JavaScript package, therefore it relies and has a requirement that you install Node.js first. Node.js, an open source, well-known JavaScript runtime environment. And this Graphman client command line interface is very easy to use. It supports a great, generic, flexible way in accessing the gateways and reading data, and at the end also changing data. It supports two kind of different authentication types, user ID and password, as well as client certificate-based MTLS connections. And even more, it is customizable. So if you have a specific kind of query necessity, you can just write your GraphQL query and use this GraphQL query with the Graphman client as well. Additionally to that, Broadcom provides the ability to write or to provide so-called user exits during the processing of the data in this Graphman client. So you have a great flexibility to influence stuff if you need to, if you want to. The Graphman client command line interface provides a set of different commands, which I listed here. This list is not complete. I just listed the main ones in my understanding. Export and import, quite obvious. The export reads stuff from the gateway. The import imports stuff to the gateway, which means it might create things, it might update things, it might delete stuff, depending on the content of the request. You have diff and combine. Diff is a very handy and helpful tool when it comes to, I want to know exactly what are the differences between the kind of package I have and what is on my target gateway. In my understanding, this is a very important necessity to have that kind of information available. Combine is just the opposite. While diff tells you the differences, somehow separating information, the combine part will combine information together. I missed to mention that the Graphman client works with JSON bundle. So the export and import always uses so-called JSON bundles. A JSON bundle, more or less, consists of a list of entities grouped by their resource type. In fact, it is very easy to read. However, there's even a better representation, in my understanding, for this kind of data through the explode command. The explode command takes the bundle and exploding it into single files. The result is that each entity which is part of the bundle is represented in its single file. That makes it so understandable what is in your bundle and so transparent what is in your and visible what is in your bundle what will you might change in your target gateway. That's just fantastic. Sorry, I'm really excited about this functionality. Implode does just the opposite. It implodes an exploded version into a JSON bundle again. Another very, very helpful command recently added to the GA version of the Graphman client is describe. You might remember I mentioned that the GraphQL API is based on a schema, and the schema is defining what you can do with this GraphQL API. The describe command can be used to get aware of what you can use with this API. So you can ask for what queries are available. How does the result? How does the result look like? What properties do you know? What can I use as a property name, and so on. Many asks or questions you might have when acting with gateways can be answered by the describe command. And there are some more that are helpful as well. So you have in my understanding, a very generic tool available, which can be used to read exactly what you need to read from a gateway, which can be used to change exactly what you want to change on a target gateway in a way which, at least to me, is completely different to what my experience with GMU provides. Anyway, let's proceed. This is a kind of, if I'm talking too much, just interrupt me, please. Oops, it's breaking something from my desktop, sorry. A kind of comparison between GMU and Graphman. It's not complete, of course. There are many, many more differences. There is a list, as far as I'm aware, available in the official documentation, where you see the dedicated or the complete list of differences between GMU and Graphman. First of all, my main parts are GMU is working with XML bundles, while Graphman is working with JSON bundles. With GMU, you're mostly working with a single XML bundle file. At least this was the way I was working. Graphman provides this exploded format I just mentioned a second ago, one file per resource entity, which provides a great visibility and transparency what the bundle is consisting of. My experience with GMU, especially when you do exports, it is very slow. While comparing to Graphman, it's just fast as hell. Sorry for this this wording. Anyway, I'm really excited. I mentioned the next point just because this has been changed recently. While when you update a policy or a service with GMU, the beloved revision history is of course maintained as well.
Sessie, nu probeer ik voor die tijd net thuis te zijn. Ik krijg dat net niet.
Hello, can you please mute? Sorry. Okay, thank you. Meanwhile, Graphman supports the version histories as well. At the beginning, and when I'm saying beginning, Graphman is available as a pre-release feature since Gateway version 10, I think 3.04. I'm not sure about this. However, it's there for a period of time already. And at that time, revision history wasn't maintained anymore. This was a big surprise for many people in my area. I'm guessing the principle behind that, it wasn't supported at the beginning, was, well, we are not maintaining versions in the gateway anymore, but we are maintaining versions in GitLab, or in a repository, I should say. It doesn't need to be GitLab. But I will talk about this kind of interesting thought in a minute. My understanding of deploying with GMU means you are deploying dependencies. That means all the dependencies get exported by GMU automatically as well. Hence, you are importing them into the target gateway potentially as well. And that means that you might overwrite stuff you are not aware of that you're overwriting stuff. With Graphman, you are not deploying, you don't need to deploy dependencies, you can deploy differences. Only stuff that is different to the target gateway. This reduces the amount of changes in your target system, which is especially important when you think about production gateways. you need to have full control about what you are changing. And in my understanding, Graphman provides exactly this. That means also in GMU you have partial content control, while in Graphman you have the full content control. You know exactly what you are doing. Right? Transparency is key here. Another important difference is how folders are handled. While folders in GMU are an entity on their own, Graphman doesn't handle folders as a separate entity, but it handles folder paths as a property of a service or a policy. That means you have complete transparent folder handling. Changing the folder path of a service, importing it to the target gateway, leads to a move of a service from one folder, potentially from one folder to the other, which was, I shouldn't say, but in my understanding, it was a nightmare when using the GMU. So even there, more generic understanding, more generic capabilities, which is very helpful. I'm not sure in GMU. My understanding in GMU, we were mostly working with services, policies, and folders. While so you have a kind of selected resource type support or restricted resource type support. While in Graphman, you could, in my understanding, do these kind of deployment work for all kind of resources, whether it is a key, a certificate chain in a key, whether it is a certificate and trust store, whether it is a listen port, and so on. All these entities from the policy manager are manageable by Graphman. The note here, where's my mouse pointer? The note in my first comparison, I'm getting to it. Just hold on a second. Here's my pointer. The star here, I just want to talk about this a little. Yes, JSON bundle, the resource properties, the resource entity properties are handled in JSON. However, if you think about services and policies, those are still handled in XML. However, and this is an improvement and an advantage as well, as far as I'm aware, this is under development and improvement and evolvement. Different formats are already supported, at least partially, like YAML and JSON, which provides a very much better readability for us humans when it comes to, well, what are the code differences between that version and this version. Once understood this concept, it's just clear that XML, YAML, JSON are just different kind of representations of the code, of the programming logic of a policy or a service, nothing else. In my understanding, in midterm, Broadcom might support, and please correct me if I'm wrong, might support editing of code not only through the policy manager, but through the YAML version or the JSON version. That might provide even some more flexibility in how do we handle code on a gateway.
Yeah, you're not wrong, Michael. That's what we refer to as policy as code, and it's also been released as preview. And it works through Graphman, but it's also a core gateway capability. So even though that Graphman is GA, policy as code is still preview, and it's still early in terms of its maturity, but we have a lot of plans for it too.
Yeah, thank you for this input. Yeah, great things are coming, so to say. For not demonstration, but just some simple examples to get you an impression how easy it might be to use this Graphman client, this Graphman command line interface. Graphman.sh is the command you're executing here in your bash, potentially Linux based. I'm used to use the git bash on my Windows system because I'm originally coming more from the Linux side, but there is a bat wrapper as well available. So if you're not familiar with bash, just use the bat wrapper. You would just use a different extension here. The first parameter is always the command you want to execute. You remember I've listed some of them. Export, for example, this first command is exporting a service. A service is identified by its resolution path. Hence, I'm specifying the resolution path I want to take a look at, or I want to export. The rest is mostly the same. I'm specifying an output file name, and of course, I'm specifying a gateway, which gateway to connect to, which gateway I want to extract from or export from. You can maintain a list of gateways. Meanwhile, this is very helpful as well. However, you can also specify your kind of connectivity parameters on the command line directly. So you have flexibility there as well. Second, well, I've listed these first three because these are the typical use cases for GMU. Using the using parameter always specifies the query, the GraphQL query you are sending to your API, to the Graphman API. So this one is an export of a policy. A policy is identified by its name. By the way, if you are not sure what entity is identified by what property name, just use the describe command. It will tell you what you need to do. Again, an output file and a target source gateway where to export from. And last but not least, the folder export. Even though the name is folder here, it exports the folder content. This is the important thing here. It traverses to the hierarchy of the given folder path and exports all policies and services that are contained by this folder path and subfolders. An example for the diff command, where you can compare bundles, you can compare bundle to bundle, you can compare bundle to a gateway, you can compare a gateway to a gateway. The results differ a little bit. Recently, there was the adding of a kind of diff report that will tell you if you want to bring a target gateway to a certain state, you need to do these inserts, you need to do these updates, and you need to do these deletes. So a very handy and helpful tool when it comes to have control about your deployments. We use this kind of diff capability, especially when we do the rollback, a rollback from a certain deployment back to a previous state. This is an example for the explode command. You just have an input, a bundle as an input, and a directory name as an output. As I mentioned, the bundle will be exploded into this directory with subdirectories for each resource type, and each subdirectory consists of a list of files for each entity for this resource type. The import command looks simple as well. You just say, well, I have this bundle to be imported. An output gets written, which tells you exactly what has been done for each resource entity in your input bundle. And again, a gateway specifier for the target gateway you want to import to. You also have control about dependencies, something which we used to have in GMU as well, but it's a little bit different. Here you have capabilities to say, well, I'm only interested in direct dependencies or in all dependencies. The difference is direct dependencies are those that are directly referenced in a policy, for example. Imagine you mention a cluster-wide property in your return template. This, if you say, well, I'm interested in the direct dependencies, this would be included in your export. All dependencies would lead to that it traverses to all the hierarchy, to the complete hierarchy of dependencies. So you get even more information out of. Just want to mention that. Okay. Yeah, that's already all to Graphman. Any kind of question, thought, comment?
I have a question actually about the mappings. How do the mappings managed with the Graphman? For example, with the dependencies example, the last one, we may have some cluster-wide properties and we don't want to overwrite the cluster-wide properties at the target site.
Yeah.
As we have the similar thing with the GMU and the, Yeah,
I completely understand. And this task is necessary when you do deployments, of course, you have to differentiate between code and config, so to say. However, there is a mapping command available as well. You can create mappings for a complete resource type, similar to what we know from GMU. But you can also create a mapping for dedicated resource entities and handle each entity separately if you need to. So I have to admit that I have no experience with the mappings command. We did it differently at that customer. We are separating config from code in a different way. However, more or less, I'm in the progress to move over to the, let me say, more supported and expected way in doing things. But it is possible. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, does it mean that you have two repositories, for example, one repository for the source code and the other one for the configuration, and at some point you combine the source code with the
understood. Yes, understood your question. At least I think so, but no. As I said, we are just doing it differently, and just be a little bit patient. We might come to that point how we do it for this customer.
Thank you.
But yes, these are the basic questions we had at the beginning as well. I'm not quite sure, and maybe someone from Broadcom can comment on this. At the beginning, the mapping functionality wasn't there. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is correct. We actually added it later. I think the idea in the beginning was to just push your changes, right? So you would only push a cluster-wide property with Graphman, with Graphman if you wanted it to make a change in the target environment. But, people had a lot of experience with GMU and Restman and using entity mapping and pushing big bundles with everything, and then wanting to use mapping to only selectively apply certain changes in certain ways. So we did add a similar mapping capability to Graphman so people could have the same experience with Graphman. And you could use them, interchangeably, depending on what works best for you. There's conveniences to both, and you probably took the former approach, especially because you got started with Graphman early.
Exactly. When we started with Graphman, the mapping's capability wasn't just there. It wasn't just there, and hence we needed to think about, well, how do we want to do it? And we haven't yet, upgraded it, upgrading our procedures to the mapping capability, which might make sense to just be more aligned to what Broadcom thinks about how things need to be done or should be done. All right, thank you very much. Next part is only 2 slides or so about GitLab itself. What is GitLab? It's a versioning tool at the end. At the end, it provides the ability to have a central storage for gateway configuration data. And when I'm saying configuration data, I'm not differentiating between code and config here. It's all the same. It's about having a repository which represents the gateway, so to say. A big advantage, and this is really a big thing, automatically when you do this, you have version control over all entities of your gateway. So you would be able to understand how your cluster-wide property changes over time. You have a complete history of all resource types of your gateway. This is also an improvement in transparency and at the end in control. We decided at the beginning I was using the imploded format because technically it's just not needed. It's technically only the imploded format is needed. However, getting aware that a JSON bundle in its complexity and its amount of entities is potentially hard to read as well. The exploded format is just the better way in doing stuff, because it provides better readability, better visibility, better transparency, better understanding when you need to read stuff, when you need to understand things. However, exports and imports are always done in an imploded format. The exploded format, as I mentioned it, is just a different representation, helpful for humans like me. One more potentially explanation to the exploded format. I don't have an example here, unfortunately, but well, think about a JSON bundle gets exploded into separate directories per resource type. All resources of one resource type gets its own, so to say, own subdirectory and gets its own file. So when you explode an export of a gateway, which consists of cluster-wide properties, you will have a subdirectory called cluster properties. And in that directory, you will have so many files as you have cluster properties on your gateways. And each cluster property file consists of the properties of this cluster property, like but typically name and value and internal things and checksum, but these are internal things. So this makes it, in my understanding, very transparent and understandable what kind of resources do you maintain on the gateway? Do you have on the gateway? And yeah, I'm excited about the exploded format, but I should continue here. And because, and this is maybe worth to mention, all resources that are maintained in a folder tree in the policy manager will be exploded to a subdirectory called tree. And below that tree directory, this directory structure is exactly the same as the folder structure in the policy manager. So even there, great flexibility, great visibility, and if you move stuff around in that directory structure, implode it and import it back, you don't have to mess around with folders anymore. The API just takes care that stuff is there where you expect, that folders exist where you expect them. Very, very helpful things. At the end, GitLab is here used as the central tool also from an organizational point of view. I named it, well, it provides process, meaning, well, it's more than just the technical side of things. It is, well, how do you collaborate with your colleagues? Who is reviewing your stuff? How do you review stuff? How do you handle all these kind of different necessities when thinking about deployments? And this could be easily handled by GitLab. But I mentioned it doesn't have to be GitLab. It should be a repository. The main thing here, GitLab provides the ability to have a kind of ticket which describes your deployment. Anyway, you have to think about your branch strategy, for example. When you come from the source code development side of things, you might be very familiar with it. When you come from the gateway side only, like me, so to say, these kind of branch strategies are somehow new. We at that customer are doing it very, very simple and straightforward. So to say, we have the master branch, which holds the current state of a gateway and which is protected, so nobody is able to change anything on the master branch beside the foreseen process, so to say. And when we have, yeah, question? No. Okay. And when you do a deployment branch is created beside or at the same time a merge request for this deployment branch is created. The deployment branch.
O nome da epá, não faço ideia. Então.
I'm sorry.
Isso é aqueles nomes internos malucos que eles têm, mas por que é que precisas de saber isso?
Jose, can you go on mute, or Pam, can you mute everybody?
Mas não tem lá o placement.
I will. Let me.
A sério?
All right, back to you, Michael. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry about that. I'll try to continue.
Oh, and Michael, you got muted too. So you just got to take yourself off mute. And we don't do anything by half measures. So Michael, you're on mute in the WebEx.
Well, you did say mute everybody.
I'm trying to unmute him. I don't know. I said ask to unmute. So hopefully he gets that.
It looks like he got dropped somehow. I don't see him on the call anymore.
No, he's on.
Oh, okay.
Michael, you could stop sharing and there you go. Unmute.
Yeah, I'm very sorry that I'm that unfamiliar with this tool.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
It's
I'm joining. I'm joining through the browser, and I need to find my way somehow.
We're sorry. We muted you. Why don't you just pick up where you left off? You've been doing great.
No worries. No worries. Do I still share?
We see your WebEx. Go ahead and yeah, there you go. That's good. You're back to where you were.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to talk about a little bit about the branch strategy we are using here. A very simple one. We just have a master branch which holds the current state of the gateway and is, of course, a protected one. Protected means the master branch isn't changeable so easily, only by merge request from other branches. And when we do deployments, we do have a deployment branch which holds the deployment specific data only. This is the way we decided to work. It can be done differently, no doubt about it. But well, at the end, this works at least for this customer currently. I will mention that at the end again. This is something which evolves over time anyway. Anyway, let me proceed. Changes to the master branch are done through merge requests. And merge request is a type of ticket that provides exactly the organizational kind of activities that are necessary, like the merge request ticket can handle the approval, it can handle the review process and related activities. This all can be controlled by the merge request. The merge request also supports the draft mode. This is helpful for when I, as a developer, creating deployment, the merge request that gets automatically created for me by our tooling, so to say, is in draft mode. That means a draft mode merge request cannot be merged at all. Because this is still not ready, I'm, as a developer, am able to finalize the package before I'm saying, okay, this is my package which I want to deploy. Now it's ready. Now I resolve the draft mode. Now the review can begin and the approval can begin. And finally, the merge can begin, which triggers the deployment. Yeah, and the merge request can be the central tool for collaboration as well. A conversation with the different parties that are involved, the requester, the reviewer, the approvers, and even the merger, so to say. So that is meant when I'm saying process, process, process. You have to think about how do you want to work? How are people used to work? How can they collaborate the best? How do you implement these kind of organizational procedures? That understanding, finally, that understanding leads to the understanding that your master branch is the single source of truth. Not the gateway defines how the gateway should look like, but the repository defines how the gateway should look like. This is true for all gateways except dev. This is a separate discussion to discuss, but it would take too much time, I think. Anyway, the repository defines how the gateway should look like, not vice versa. I don't know if you have already looked into the Kubernetes controller, but this understanding is exactly what the Kubernetes controller provides. The repository defines how the gateway should look like. It is the single source of truth, something which is important to understand. And because of that, you have capabilities like rugged change detection. You have capabilities to say, I want to revert my gateway to a state way back weeks ago, so to say, because the repository holds all this history information, and it's fairly easy to revert a gateway to a previous state. Thinking about GMU, I shouldn't say it, but one more time, I guess this is a nightmare. If you're not taking care about having appropriate backups available and all these necessities that are necessary to roll back to a certain point in time. Anyway, continue. How do I continue that way? Okay, that was already all about GitLab.
Before we continue, may I ask some questions to Broadcom people actually? Like with the GitLab example you presented, I remember I know that the policy versioning and the service versioning is available on the gateway. As we right click on an API or a policy, we able to see the version history, for example. The first question is, do we have a chance to use the same versioning stuff for the cluster-wide properties, which was not available previously? Maybe in the recent versions, it's also available. I don't remember. And the second question is, in use cases like you have, do we have a chance to disable the versioning on the gateway side to keep the source code lightweight on the gateway database?
Yeah, great questions. I'm happy that both Michael introduced his use of GitLab with Graphman and that you asked those questions, Masood. First customers have been using version control like Git and GitLab, even with Restman for a long time. Graphman just makes it easier, and especially with exploding bundles into individual files representing each of the entities. But we are definitely doubling down on Git and any Git compatible tool like GitLab. Michael brought it up with the layer 7 operator as an alternative deployment model for gateway containers in Kubernetes, and with support for portal use cases too. One of the primary things the operator does is leverage Git repos as the source of truth for gateways that it deploys with both static and dynamic configuration loaded from Git. And so there's that. I like that you brought up some policy manager capabilities related to what Michael's been talking about Git, because we are beginning a new initiative to develop a new management user interface that will end up doing many things and may very well be a complete replacement for policy manager. And one of the things we're looking at some of the things we're looking at for that new user interface is for it to be able to operate directly on exploded Graphman bundles by pointing to them in your file system. Those could be managed by Git. We might even pull a Git user experience directly into that new UI, so that from the UI you can, branch, merge, check in, check out, pull, push, all the things you would expect to do with Git. Now, in terms of policy manager, right now you can only version policies in policy manager. We haven't enhanced policy manager in any way to version anything else. The point Michael was making is if you do export all of your configuration using Graphman into a Git repository, now you get versioning for all of it, including cluster-wide properties. There's no way to, turn off policy revision history through policy manager and on the gateway and as persisted in the gateway's database. But if I'm not mistaken, you might be able to control the number of policy revisions that will get persisted before they're overwritten if you haven't made comments on them. And that could reduce some of that overhead in maintaining policy revisions. You also don't have to technically use them when you're using Graphman, though we've extended Graphman to support policy revisions recently too.
Yeah, if we set this variable to 1, for example, it will be similar to disabling maybe policy versioning, max revisions, the property. I think this is cluster-wide property, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So hopefully that answers your questions and introduces some things that we're working on that are going to build on top of Graphman, on top of Git, with a new UI, allowing Git to become the source of truth. That's also something more and more customers are interested in doing to move away from databases altogether. And there's a rather big push for that too. So thanks for that, Michael. I guess back to you. Just a quick time check. We got 10 minutes left, but
I see that as well. Yeah. Anyway, maybe I'm just adding here. Looking at that customer I was working for, people get used to use GitLab instead of using policy manager to look at gateways. They are just switching over because they are getting aware it's so much easier looking at the GitLab repository to get aware of how does this cluster-wide property look like, how it was actually changed in the history. Very interesting kind of move of necessity, so to say, especially when I come to my fourth chapter, if time is enough, when you see how they need how the process is to get access to gateways from a user perspective. Anyway, I will just proceed because time is low, so to say. Jenkins is our automation orchestrator. Nothing special. Well, there's always a learning curve when you start with Jenkins. A workflow definition in Jenkins is called a pipeline. It's like a scripted workflow, so to say. A single execution of one pipeline is called a build. Of course, each execution gets its own number and has its own log status, etc. This is, well, you're always able to understand, well, what has been done by Jenkins and what was executed. Of course, also here, different setups are thinkable and possible. At the start, we were hosting the pipeline scripts, so to say, directly in Jenkins, while meanwhile, we are hosting them in GitLab as well, because that offers us capability of having version control through these automation scripts as well, something which might be interesting for you as well. Of course, we were trying to be generic as possible. That means all our pipelines we have implemented have parameters. So they can be controlled by parameters because you have use cases and it's a different use case, and it's always important to understand what is common in our use cases and what is different. And if possible, be as generic as possible. What is different can be potentially controlled by parameters. So for example, our deployment pipeline has, let me say, 3 or 4 parameters. One is saying, well, this is the source environment, this is the target environment, this is the deployment package, go do your work. And I can reuse this kind of pipeline for each kind of deployment from each environment to each environment. And we have a bunch of them there. You will see that in a minute. The pipelines can be started in various different ways, either by, of course, by the Jenkins user interface itself, or what we are doing to automate things by GitLab, so-called GitLab webhooks, especially for deployment-related activities in Jenkins. What's next? Yeah, I've just listed some of the pipelines we've implemented. To get you an idea about what we have done at that customer. We have one pipeline which creates a repository. Imagine you have a gateway which has not yet been reflected as represented as a repository. You need to kind of extract everything from that gateway and create a repository. We implemented this as a pipeline to assure that all the repositories we have, and these repositories are environment-based, not gateway-based. You will see the difference in a minute. Are looking the same from their structure. Only then you can assure that everything can be parameterized and can be generic as much as possible. This little guy here, repo to gateway differences, compares repositories to gateways. That, for example, supports ROGU change detection, and it even supports differences between environments. Very interesting point here. Get aware of, well, obviously environments should look the same in a certain kind of matter, so to say, but this pipeline can be used to identify if they are not look the same at the certain points. We have implemented a pipeline called Graphman all-purpose that is helpful if you have a set of gateways and you're looking for the same kind of information. For example, I want to have a list of all JDBC connections of all gateways at once. So we have a pipeline for that as well. And we have the 2 deployment-related pipelines, prepare package and deploy package. Both are triggered by GitLab, while the first 3 are executed by the UI. Meanwhile, we have additional pipelines that are handling reoccurring stuff, though they are executed each and every morning, so to say. So you're very free to do your automation. But from an automation perspective, it's nothing special here. Just wanted to list to get you an idea about what different kind of automation activities you might have as well if you go this direction.
And Michael, I hate to interrupt, but just a quick time check. We have like 4 minutes left.
Yeah, That's cool. Well, unfortunately, I will use these formats, and Q&A will get very, very.
Okay, I'm just a heads up.
Yeah. Okay.
It might now asking questions along the way, Michael. Just keep going. You're doing good.
Yeah. Okay. I will. The last chapter I named all together now because these three kind of tools are playing together and providing a great flexibility and great opportunity to automate your stuff. This little picture here tries to explain how the infrastructure of the user looks like. So if the user wants to connect to a gateway, he first needs to connect to a jump server. This is controlled by Privileged Access Manager. Then he has an open session to that jump server. And from this jump server, he is able to connect to a gateway in a specific environment. You might see that there are obviously more than one gateway in an environment. That's exactly the case here. The customer has 4 different gateways in that environment, and I'm not talking about clustered gateways. I'm talking about gateways with different roles. They have a unique set of APIs. They have a unique role. They have a unique purpose. And that leads to the understanding that, well, if you want to do development work, you are often in a situation that you're not only developing on one gateway, but on a second or third gateway as well, because somehow they are related to each other. Some of them are exposed to the outside world, some of them are not exposed, only accessible internally. So you have a kind of, I shouldn't say complex, but well, not an easy situation here. And 4 gateways per environment. When we are taking a look at this kind of infrastructure setup, the customer has 7 different environments. Development, test, DB staging, business as usual, pre-prod, prod, and disaster recovery. So there's a fair amount of number of gateways we have to maintain. And for the user, it was just the hell to get access to these gateways and do manual work through GMU. I don't want to list all the manual activities which were necessary to do a deployment through GMU. Anyway, we decided to let Jenkins have access to all these gateways. Not just by, but by implementing appropriate firewall rules. And you can need to understand that each environment has its own jump server, so to say. So access to gateways through Jenkins is a lot easier because the jump server component is just out of the picture. Okay, what else? Next slide. This tries to give you an impression about our procedure. We named it 4-step deployment process. One thing to understand, we are only doing incremental deployment. So for each deployment, we have a dedicated list of resources we want to deploy. And it all starts more or less with development work at the top. One point in a time, the developer decides, now I am finished, done with my development work, and I don't want to deploy this stuff to the next environment. So he initializes the deployment by creating a deployment configuration file, which exactly describes the list of dedicated resources. This triggers Jenkins through GitLab. Jenkins prepares this deployment package by mostly exporting the dedicated resources from the source target, comparing it to the target gateways, and doing nice work to present the package in a nice format in GitLab. The next step is, again, a manual one. This is through the merge request. The developer is able, or the deployer is able to do the finalization. He can review the collected data, potentially manipulate the collected data. Then you can handle the improvement and the review stuff. And finally, you can merge this merge request into the master branch, which will trigger Jenkins again, which then deploys the package to the target environment. And just as an example, I've listed this deployment config file, so you can specify what gateway you want to work on. Let's say a gateway 1, and you want to export a service with this resolution path. And additionally, you need to deploy a policy from gateway 2 with this policy name. And as a third example, you also want to copy over a cluster-wide property with this name, but you need to override the value to the target environment specific value. Just as an example, very simple. So this kind of functionality is available. That way you have a good control over well, what do I need to deploy, what do I want to deploy, and through GitLab you have complete control about the content of your package. Very straightforward. Next slide. Sorry, I'm hurrying up a bit. This is more a kind of principal flow picture. I was trying to explain about how does it look like from a data flow perspective and integration perspective. In the middle, you have GitLab as more or less as the central tool for organizing deployments. When initiating deployment, you have a merge request, and depending on the activity on the merge request, this triggers pipelines in Jenkins, which will clone the Graphman client repository from GitLab to have the Graphman client available, as well as environment-specific repositories, depending on what deployment is currently worked on. And the pipeline itself is, of course, using the Graphman client to export data from gateways and to import data to gateways. So this is a high level kind of, well, this is how it works more or less. My last slide, be happy. Philosophy, it's all dependent on what are the customer's requirements, as always in these kind of projects. But to me, it's important to understand it's not only the technical side of things you have to think about. There's a lot of organizational changes. You need to find answers to what are the most annoying pain points? How are people used to work? How do they want to work with each other? And how can people collaborate the best? At the end, you need to define the processes. How do you want to work? Yeah, that's it, more or less, from my side. Thank you very much. One more time, thanks again for this opportunity to talk about the experiences I was able to collect. I'm very happy to work for that customer because it was so excited to improve his deployment capabilities in a very comfortable way. Yeah, that's me. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great session, Michael. It was really enjoyable. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.